Snow had fallen 3 days ago, but Ravenhill still hadn't awakened. The main road into town lay hidden beneath a smooth, white blanket, so thick and seamless that the edges and center lines had vanished altogether. Street lamps along the path flickered in a sleepy yellow haze, casting only faint glows, like memories that refused to fade from a place that had once felt warmer, more alive. The sky above was gray, without sunlight, and without any sign of another storm. Only stillness remained. A stillness so complete it felt like the world was holding its breath. At the northern edge of town, where the ground sloped gently into hills and rows of old pine trees stood like guards long forgotten, there was a small wooden cabin. Its pitched roof was buried in snow, nearly up to the chimney. The windows, fogged from the inside, revealed nothing of what was within, just streaks of weathered wood and the slow fingerprint of time. No smoke, no music, no motion, only wind. A quiet, ceaseless wind, not howling, not whistling, but there all the same, like a breath drawn in and never released. It wrapped itself around the hill like a silent guardian. Beneath all that snow, time itself seemed to have stopped. A tin wind chime hung above the porch, unmoving. It hadn't rung once since winter began. Ice had sealed the steps. The last footprints in the snow had long been faded over, yet if one looked closely, they might still make out their shape. 3 canine prints, walking in rhythm, accompanied by the dragging imprint of heavy boots. Those prints could belong to only one man in Ravenhill. Everyone knew his name, but no one approached him anymore. Walter Reed. Inside the house, the silence was even deeper. No radio, no clatter of a stove. Just a pendulum clock on the wall, rocking gently, though its hands had stopped at 3:14. No one remembered when. At the end of the hallway, a thick wooden door stood ajar, revealing the only room still lit. A single beam from a desk lamp rested over a wooden cabinet, its surface untouched by dust. Atop it lay an old leather-bound notebook, the cover sun-faded and worn at the corners. Lightly etched into its surface were the words, "The dream of a little cat, Eleanor." No one in town knew Eleanor had once dreamed of a cat. They only remembered her as the woman who smiled often, picked wildflowers each morning, and said thank you to even the mailman. But Walter remembered everything. And because he remembered, he kept everything exactly as it had been. The cushion by the window still bore the soft indent where Eleanor once read. The kitchen counter still held 3 bowls, the 4th never used, though she often reminded him that one day they might need it for someone smaller. That day never came. Only snow did, and the space she left behind. In Ravenhill, people used to say, "On that hill, you'll hear 3 breaths, 1 human, 3 canine." But this winter perhaps only 1 breath remained. The rest was wind, and the echo of what used to be. Walter Reed was not a man of many words. In fact, since Eleanor's funeral, he had spoken to almost no one. But that didn't mean he lived alone. In the house that no longer made a sound, there were 3 beings always present. Not because they were commanded, not because they were leashed. They simply stayed. 3 Malinois dogs, once trained to leap into burning homes, crawl through toxic smoke, and track scents through forest floods, now lived in quiet with Walter on the White Hill, each with their own rhythm, their own breath, as if carrying a piece of memory that Walter himself could no longer bear alone. Rex, the oldest, was all solid muscle, the veteran who once pulled a child from beneath a collapsed burning home on Ravenhill's West Ridge, back when Walter led the rescue team. Now, gray fur crept in around his eyes. His legs hesitated when rising, but his stance was still firm, unshakable. Rex rarely wagged his tail. He simply lay at Walter's feet as the old man reread Eleanor's notebook, as if he too knew every mark on the page was an old wound being reopened. Toby, the middle one, was all sharp edges and alert silence, a sentinel by instinct. At the faintest sound, he was the first to rise, back straight, ears forward, staring toward the window. Once, he detected a hidden electronic trigger in a chemical plant fire. His 3 short barks that day had saved the entire fire crew. Even now, in a home with no alarms to raise, Toby behaved like a soldier on duty. He patrolled the doors, slept with one eye open, curled along the edge of the wooden porch like it was the boundary of a mission. Gia, the youngest of them all, was the only one Eleanor never had the chance to name. She had arrived 3 months before Eleanor passed, thin, guarded, always keeping a cautious distance from anything unfamiliar. Eleanor once whispered, "This little girl doesn't trust anyone. But she will, if she's loved the right way." Gia hadn't learned that lesson yet. She ate alone, in a quiet corner away from her brothers, never joined their sleep, and would sometimes growl, softly, if Walter stepped too close in the dark. But every morning, without fail, when Walter opened the door, Gia was the first to be there, silent, waiting for the walk as if it were a ritual beyond words. Walter never gave commands. He didn't need to. Each dog seemed to know where he was going before even he did. People in town, when they happened to catch a glimpse of them from a distance, would often say, "He doesn't walk with his dogs. They move like a unit." And they were right. Walter was not a man who needed crowds, but since Eleanor passed, the house had become far too quiet for a man to survive in without another breath nearby. Rex breathed in memory. Toby breathed in instinct. And Gia breathed in vigilance, as if she had taken Eleanor's place in guarding him from the one thing no one could ever escape: emptiness. Some people, after losing the one they love, change everything: paint the walls, throw out keepsakes, erase every scent as if trying to sever the string that pulls them back to yesterday. Walter did the opposite. He preserved everything. The gray house slippers Eleanor wore every winter were still neatly placed by the fireplace. Her folded handkerchief, still carrying the faint trace of old lavender, remained in the second drawer of the writing desk. Even the books she'd left half-read, spines cracked from being folded when she grew tired. He let no one touch them. Not even the glass vase, fine-lined with a crack at its neck, was left empty. Walter kept a few dried asters inside, as though touching it would make memory shatter. But the one thing he kept most carefully was the soft leather notebook Eleanor used to carry nearly every day. It sat in the second drawer of the desk by the window, her favorite spot each morning, tea in hand, 3 dogs asleep at her feet. The cover had faded to a deep brown, the stitching along the edges fraying with time. The first page was written in faint lavender ink, the kind she once said was only for the things we hope for but are too afraid to say aloud. That page read, "A dream of a little cat. Not to change the world, but to change one small corner of a heart." Walter had read that line so many times, he could recite every pause in it. He remembered the afternoon Eleanor had written it, late autumn, after they visited the local animal shelter, and she held a small gray kitten in her hands, smiling as she said, "What do you think? Something softer, among our 3 stubborn ones?" He'd brushed it off at the time, joking that the Malinois had already taken up all the space and all his patience. But Eleanor hadn't let the idea go. The next pages in the notebook were filled with lists of cat breeds that got along with dogs, non-allergenic food brands, even ways to help cats stay calm when dogs barked. She'd clipped and pasted a photo from a magazine, a tiny tabby curled asleep between 2 hunting dogs, and drew a small arrow pointing to it with the words, "I believe this is real." After she passed, Walter almost burned the notebook. He even lit the match, held it close. But his hand trembled as the flame neared the page. And then he stopped. Maybe because he already knew. That notebook wasn't just about a cat. It was the part of Eleanor that still dreamed, even when her body no longer could. Many nights, Walter would open that notebook and read each word as if listening to Eleanor, whispering softly beside his ear. Sometimes he sat in complete silence. Other times, his large, weathered hand would brush across the violet ink, like touching the delicate skin of someone who once lived, and perhaps in some way still did, through all the things left unfinished. And because he had never fulfilled her final wish, Walter could never quite call himself a survivor. He was simply waiting for something gentle enough, strange enough, to make him believe that maybe, just maybe, it was still possible to begin again from the part of the dream she had left unwritten. That day, darkness fell earlier than usual. The snow had stopped, but the wind had shifted, sharper now, slicing through cracks in the doors like dry, cold fingers knocking against old memory. Walter sat at the windowsill, a worn brown sweater pulled up to his neck, hands wrapped around a mug of cooling tea, eyes fixed on the endless white outside. The three dogs lay motionless, like living statues. Only Toby's ears twitched now and then as the wind changed pace. And then, like a blink behind closed lashes, Walter saw it. A faint movement, just at the edge of the snowbank, where the tree's roots had re-emerged from a brief midday thaw. At first he thought it was his eyes playing tricks, but when Toby lifted his head, ears pricked, gaze aligned with Walter's, he knew it was real. Amid the wide, silent expanse of snow sat a tiny shape, no larger than a teapot, curled into a blurred, trembling bundle. Soaked gray fur, no sound, no motion, no resistance. Walter opened the door. The wind rushed in. Toby stood. Gia squinted. Rex tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something buried deep beneath the snow. Walter stepped forward, each footfall crunching like brittle pages turning in a book too long unopened. As he drew closer, he realized it was a kitten, likely no more than 3 months old. Snow clung to her body, but her eyes were wide, clear, staring straight at him. There was no fear, no pleading, only presence, quiet, steady, strangely still. Walter stopped. His heart thudded, not fast but sharp, just enough to remind him that his hands were cold not just from the snow. He looked down at the fragile creature in front of him, and suddenly, a familiar line from Eleanor's notebook echoed in his mind. "I believe this is real." The kitten did not flinch. She didn't avert her gaze, nor did she crawl toward him. She simply was, sitting in the snow like something that had slipped through a crack in the world. Walter knelt. Toby moved forward a step. Rex let out a low growl, but Walter held out his hand, this calloused, fire-hardened hand that had once pulled people from collapsing buildings, now gentler than it had ever been. And then, the strangest thing happened. The kitten didn't run, she didn't retreat. She tilted her head, just slightly, as if weighing a decision beyond human language. Then, softly, she placed one paw on the back of his hand. No sound, no startled reaction. Only acceptance. Walter lifted her. The feel of her tiny warmth against his sweater caught him off guard, not because she was cold, but because she was so light, as if she carried nothing with her but herself. On the way back towards the cabin, he spoke only once, quieter than the wind. "Nova," If you are a fallen star, then maybe this hill is where you were meant to land. The wooden door closed behind him, but inside something had shifted, subtly, quietly, like the hand of a long-stilled clock, finally moving forward by a single, fragile tick. Walter stood still, his breath blooming into pale mist before him, his hands still cupped around the fragile life wrapped in snow. The wind tugged at his collar. Night was falling faster than it should. For a brief moment he wondered why he had stopped, why he hadn't just walked on, like he did with everything he didn't want to feel too close to. A kitten in the snow. It could have been lost, or abandoned. Or maybe just a gust of wind that had taken a wrong turn and delivered her here by mistake. He had seen eyes like that before. Eyes that didn't ask, didn't plead, just appeared, as if this world was the only place left to exist in. On burned roads, in flood zones, after the blast. Eyes of young soldiers, eyes of those on the edge of hope. Eyes that once stared back at him from the mirror the night Eleanor left. Walter turned. He managed 3 steps before stopping again. A faint rustle. It could have been the wind, the snow slipping from pine branches, or something else. But it made him pause, as though an invisible thread had been tied between him and that small creature behind him. One more step, and he would return to silence. But maybe, just maybe, one step would also mean crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. He turned back. The kitten was still there, not moving, not making a sound. Her eyes were wide, fixed on him, unblinking. No retreat, no flight, Walter murmured, just like her. He stepped forward. Slowly. Very slowly, like someone walking back to the place where they had once lost something that could never be replaced. He bent down, slid his hand beneath the tiny body. The fur was soaked through, trembling, yet still she didn't resist. He brought her close to his chest, opened his coat, and wrapped her in an old handkerchief he pulled from his pocket. A faint scent of lavender rose from the fabric. Eleanor had once kept it in the nightstand drawer. In the moment his hand gently closed over that small bundle against his chest, Walter felt something close to warmth. He didn't know if it came from the kitten, from the scent of long-ago comfort, or from within himself, after so many winters spent convincing his own heart it had nothing left to feel. He walked back towards the house. The snow no longer fell. Only the crunch of boots against the frozen ground remained, and a quiet breath, so soft it might have been the vapor trail of a star drifting through a white night. When he laid the kitten down on a folded cloth beside the fire, Walter didn't know how long he would keep her. A night, a week, or just until she could stand on her own. But when he sat by the hearth and poured himself another cup of tea, for the first time in months not drinking it alone, he suddenly spoke. Nova. The name rang gently in the wooden cabin. Not a common name for a cat, but it had come to him like instinct. Nova, the star Eleanor had always loved, the one she placed on the pine tree each Christmas, a star born from ashes, burning bright one last time before fading. She said, he whispered, eyes on the kitten now drifting into sleep. A nova is the light that comes from something thought to be gone. He reached out and gently touched her forehead. Then if you're that kind of light, stay a while. The moment Walter carried Nova across the threshold, the house changed. Not in warmth, but in tension, like something ancient had been stirred awake. Toby was the first to respond. He sprang up from the back door, head lowered, ears rigid. A sound escaped him. Not a growl, but a low click from somewhere deep in the body, the sound of instincts flicking into place. His gaze held no anger, but it calculated. Gia let out a sharp bark. Short, snapped, a single burst of alarm, like a system alert hitting red. She immediately stepped back, dropped low to the ground, tail tucked, but her eyes never left the small creature resting in Walter's arms. Her back arched slightly, not to attack, but to shield. Gia didn't handle new things well. Rex was different. He didn't move. From where he lay by the base of the chair, Rex gave one glance. Just one. Then turned his head away and rested it back against the edge of the rug, as if nothing had happened at all. But Walter knew better. He had seen that subtle twitch in Rex's ear, the slightest rotation, barely noticeable. Rex was listening. He always listened, always watched, but he only acted when it truly mattered. Walter said nothing. He gently laid Nova down on a folded cloth beside the fireplace, where the bricks had already begun to warm. The kitten curled into herself, but she didn't hide. She trembled, from cold, from hunger, but her eyes remained open, watching, following, never blinking. Toby moved closer, cautiously, each step deliberate, measured like an old drill routine, no rush, no invitation. When he was just a few hands away, he lowered his head, not to stalk, but to examine. What was this creature's scent? Was it a threat? Did it pose risk to the unit? Nova looked up. Her gaze didn't flinch. It didn't challenge either. It was steady, the gaze of something that had nothing left to lose and nothing to prove. Toby stopped. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He tilted his head. Then, suddenly, sat down, as if he'd seen enough. As if, in the mental checklist of a former rescue dog who had passed dozens of behavior exams, this tiny life had cleared the first test. Gia remained on edge. She barked again once, then circled around them, maintaining distance. When Walter stepped closer, she slipped behind his leg, letting out a soft hiss, not of anger, but of uncertainty. Just like the first night she arrived. Eleanor had once said, Gia reacts like a child raised by doubt. It takes time for her to trust. And now before her stood something too small, too fragile, but also not trembling the way fragile things usually did. Something about it didn't add up. And Rex, still silent. Only when Nova exhaled, just barely, a faint whisper of breath like a sigh, did Rex's ears twitch a second time. No head turn, no shift. But it was a second recognition, a second acknowledgement. Walter sat down between the three Malinois and the kitten who had just entered their world. He poured warm water into a porcelain bowl and placed it near Nova. She leaned in, licked once, softly, weakly, but with awareness. She knew it was for her. None of the dogs interfered. That moment, small as it was, felt to Walter like watching a behavioral map redraw itself in real time. No one accepted, but no one rejected either. He looked at Nova. Then at the three Malinois, his sentries, his unspoken guardians. "It's not afraid of you," he muttered, eyes still locked on Nova. The kitten now lay still, her gaze weary but open, as if silently memorizing every face in the room, whether man or not. Night settled over the town like a thick quilt drawn over everything still breathing. Ravenhill was so still that you could hear the snow melting, drop by drop, outside the porch, falling into an old wooden gutter. The fireplace crackled softly, its flames casting amber-gold streaks across the dark wooden walls, making the entire room seem like it was breathing. Nova was curled into herself on a folded cloth by the fire. She didn't press up against anyone. She didn't meow, didn't nuzzle, didn't seek warmth from man or dog. She simply lay there, eyes half shut, her tiny frame like a cooled ember. So silent it was, as if she didn't exist. Walter sat in the armchair by the window. Firelight brushed across his hands, knotted, veined fingers slowly turning the pages of Eleanor's notebook. An old pressed flower, its color now faded to near dust, marked one of the entries. There, in his wife's gently slanted handwriting, it read, "A small cat. Doesn't need to be gentle. Just don't walk away when I'm sad." He closed the notebook, but his eyes remained on the small figure lying near the fire. Toby slept in the distance, still keeping his usual perimeter like a sentry on quiet duty. Gia lay near the base of the chair, eyes already drooping, though her ears twitched at any sudden sound. Only Rex, the oldest and calmest, had settled his head close to Nova. Not too near, not too far. Walter set his tea down, fingertips grazing the edge of the cloth beside the table. He spoke softly, as if to someone who wasn't there anymore. "I'm not promising anything, but she can stay for a while." When dawn filtered through the window with its first pale light, the early wind swept ripples of snow across the roof like slow waves brushing over a sleeping shore. Walter stirred awake, not from a dream. Just as he always did, every night since Eleanor passed, never having truly slept. He stepped quietly onto the wooden floor. The room still held the chill of night. The fireplace had dimmed to fading embers. Rex was no longer at his spot. Neither was Toby. He looked toward the fur rug by the hearth and stopped. In the soft, muted light, a sight so strange met his eyes that he wondered for a moment if he was still dreaming. Nova, still the small kitten from the night before, was no longer sleeping alone. She lay at the center of three larger forms, Rex on her left. Gia curled around her feet. Toby, with his long limbs and arched neck, draped one paw gently across her back, like three living walls encircling a fragile flame. No command had been given, no hierarchy spoken, no growls, no signals, no dominance asserted. Nova rested in the middle, not afraid, not shrinking, and still sound asleep. Light as a cinder nestled in warm ash, where every trace of tension had, somehow, dissolved. Walter stood in silence. What Walter saw wasn't a cat sleeping beside dogs. It was a place, a role, a belonging. No one had made room. No one had conceded a space. And yet Nova was there, as if it had always been meant that way. As if the cracks that lined this wooden house had, at last, found a piece that never seemed to fit, but somehow did. Walter stepped closer, intending to pick up the cloth from the night before. But as he leaned down, he paused. Nova, still deep in sleep, shifted just slightly, not to pull away, but to lean in, nudging gently against Rex's foreleg. Her tail gave a faint twitch, like the flicker of a dream. Walter stepped back. He didn't speak. He simply sat down again, quieter than the dying embers. And in that stillness of early morning, for the first time in many winters, he felt that the house was no longer empty. He remained standing for a long time, hands slack by his sides, eyes tracing the fading pulse of flame inside the hearth. Nova lay there, between three Malinois. She hadn't asked, she hadn't begged, she hadn't shrunk or demanded. She was simply there, like something familiar, finally returned after being gone far too long. The dim glow from the desk lamp cast a soft light over his face, a face once hardened by fire and loss, weathered by years of silence. But in that moment something softened, like an old wall finally cracking enough to let in a sliver of light. He moved slowly, knelt beside the old wool rug. His calloused hand didn't reach out to pet, nor to push away. He simply placed it gently on the floor, close enough to feel the warmth of Nova's breath radiating across the tiles. A minute passed, then another. No one moved. No one spoke. Even Gia, usually the most guarded, tucked herself closer to Rex's side, as if something unspoken had been understood. That tonight, There would be no boundaries. Walter bowed his head. His voice rose, no louder than the soft creak of wood in the fire. Each word seemed to fall from him like something broken loose from deep within, through layers of time, through the ash of memories he once thought nothing could pass through. "I'm not promising anything." A sigh followed. Quiet, barely audible, perhaps from him, perhaps from somewhere deeper. "But you can stay for a while." Just for a while. No commitment, no bindings. But sometimes healing doesn't come from promises. It comes from allowing a creature to exist, exactly when it needs to be seen. Walter stood, stepping back slowly, his gaze still resting on that strange and quiet sight. A cat lying in peace among 3 rescue dogs, inside the home of a man who once believed his heart had closed for good. And then he turned, reached for the lamp, blew out the light. In the dark, no one saw the soft smile that touched his face. Not because he hoped for something new, but because, for the first time in a very long while, he didn't feel alone when he turned off the light. In the heart of Ravenhill, where century-old timber houses still bore the fingerprint of time, there was one home whose lights came on precisely at 6 each morning and went off without fail at 8 each evening. The front window was dressed in white lace curtains. A warm teapot and a neatly stacked pile of daily newspapers, always in chronological order, sat on the table by the glass. That house belonged to Mrs. Bernice Alcott. Bernice wasn't famous in the noisy sense. She was the kind of person who was known and impossible not to know. President of the Ravenhill Women's Circle for 17 consecutive years, she was the one who made and preserved rules most others had long forgotten. Skirts should never fall above the knee, handwritten letters must be on trimmed-edge stationery, and Sunday lunch was incomplete without a homemade apple pie. In Ravenhill, if someone forgot to send thank-you notes after their child's birthday party, Bernice would know. If you replaced your porch roofing with a color not listed in the 1996 town aesthetic charter, she would know that too. Not because she was nosy, but because, to her, preserving the order of small things was the only way to prevent a community from quietly falling apart. She lived alone, but was never lonely. Afternoon teas with fellow committee members, spring festival program reviews, neighborhood reports to the town council. Her schedule was as full as a county clerk's desk. To Bernice, the world functioned because of boundaries. People were people, dogs were dogs, children obeyed, elders set the example. Everything had a role, and roles were not meant to blur. So when her 10-year-old granddaughter, Emily, casually mentioned, "Grandpa Walter's cat walks with his dogs like they're guards or something," Bernice merely furrowed her brow. "Unnatural," she said, eyes fixed on her teacup. The next morning, when she saw it herself, Nova running alongside Rex, Toby, and Gia along the fence trail, moving like a trained rescue unit, she froze. Her dark plum coat flared gently in the wind, her knitted hat shifted slightly to one side, but the eyes beneath her carefully drawn brows did not blink. Something in her neatly ordered world had cracked. She turned abruptly and walked toward the Ravenhill Public Library, where she kept the key to the Women's Circle meeting room. At her walnut desk, she pulled out official letterhead, uncapped her blue fountain pen, and began to write. "To the Honorable Ravenhill Town Council, I write this letter as someone who has lived here for over 60 years. The pen moved steadily. Each letter, sharp, deliberate, formed a quiet indictment against something she could not yet name, but deeply felt. It wasn't about a cat walking with dogs. It was about what might happen if such a thing were accepted, because if that was allowed, then the boundaries she had upheld her entire life. What would become of them? Bernice Alcott was not easily shaken. But that morning, A dry Tuesday after 3 days of snowfall forced her to stop. She was walking down the main road toward the church, a basket of ginger cookies in hand for the Ravenhill Women's Circle's weekly meeting. The sound of her boots tapped neatly on stone, straight and precise, like the measured steps of someone coordinating a formal ceremony who would never permit herself even a half-beat off. And then she heard it, the soft clack of dog claws echoing in the cold. She turned. Down the snow-dusted path, 4 figures emerged, swift, synchronized, spaced just so, each carrying the kind of presence one only acquires through purpose and discipline. Rex led the way, his gait steady, like a seasoned commander. Toby flanked the rear left, strides deliberate, eyes scanning the surroundings. Gia bounced alongside, nose to the ground, alert and quick. But it wasn't the Malinois trio that made Bernice stop mid-step. It was Nova, the small gray cat walking right beside Rex. Her back was slightly lowered, eyes forward, tail low but not tucked, paws stepping in perfect rhythm with the group. No flinching, no fear, no hesitation. Like a member. Bernice tightened her grip on the handle of her ginger cookie basket. "Unnatural," she muttered. A child nearby, curly-haired, likely one of the Harrow girls, turned and looked at her, puzzled. "The cat," Bernice clarified, her tone firm. "It is not meant to think it's a dog." That afternoon, in the meeting room behind the town library, where community records had been kept since 1943, Bernice sat at a gleaming mahogany table. Her face was set, her spine straight as always. In her right hand, a platinum nib fountain pen hovered, poised above a fresh sheet of official stationery. The heading on the draft read, "On preserving role clarity in the rearing of domestic animals within Ravenhill." She began to write with steady strokes. "Dear council members, I write not to hinder progress, but to defend the boundaries that have made Ravenhill a place worth living in. Recently, I witnessed a cat, yes, a cat, being allowed to patrol as if it were a working dog. This not only unsettled residents, but also risks confusing younger generations about the instincts and roles of animals. A cat should remain a cat, a dog, and humans, as their stewards, must not allow them to choose behaviors that go against their nature." She paused, glanced at the final line. Grammatically sound, clear. Firm, but also, like every rule she'd ever upheld, it was written out of fear of what had never had precedent. She folded the page, but didn't seal it. A part of her hesitated, not from lack of conviction, but because of a pair of eyes. Nova's eyes that morning. Not afraid, not insolent, not pleading. Simply the gaze of a creature walking forward, alongside those who had made space for her, even though she was nothing like them. Bernice placed the letter on the table. Unsigned. She blinked. No one had taught Nova to sit guard by the door each afternoon. No one trained her to leap into the back of Walter's pickup when the town's emergency bell rang in the distance. Rex gave no command. Toby offered no cue. Gia, as always, was the first to react, but this time, someone followed. Nova had begun acting as though she had never been a cat. At first, it was small things. She would sit stiffly by the front door when unfamiliar sounds stirred outside. No hissing, no flinching, no shrinking away. She just sat, ears upright like radar dishes, eyes unblinking. Then came the moment Walter picked up his car keys and pulled on his gloves. All 3 dogs stood at once, ready like storms coiled tight with instinct. Nova rose, too. She didn't know what was coming, but she followed, low, quick, in sync. She didn't walk against the current, didn't disrupt the flow. She moved right into the small space between Toby and Gia. and when Walter opened the truck door, she jumped in without hesitation. In the back seat, Nova was nearly swallowed by muscle and fur. She didn't cry, didn't look back. She faced forward, eyes steady, as if she already understood that wherever this road led, she was meant to be on it. One afternoon in April, Walter was repainting the back fence when he heard an odd sound. Not a bark exactly, but something clipped and low like an unsteady woof. He looked up. Nova was seated by the screen door, eyes fixed on the mailman who had just placed the day's paper down. Her mouth parted. Then came the sound again, half bark, half meow, something in between alarm and greeting. The mailman took a step back, startled. That cat just barked at me? Walter shrugged. She's trying. The man laughed. Walter didn't. He didn't find it funny. He found it necessary. Because in all his years as a firefighter, Walter had seen many survive. Not because they were stronger, but because they were more adaptive. Because they didn't ask, "Who am I?" but rather, "What must I do to keep what I love?" Nova was doing that. She was learning, not to change her species, but to belong, naturally, the way leaves learn the wind, the way snow learns how to melt into the earth. By the end of that week, whispers drifted through Ravenhill. Walter's cat barks. Not a full bark, but there's something in the sound that gives me chills. It's like she wants to be heard. Or maybe she just wants to be understood. And across town, in the room where Bernice had left her unsigned letter on the desk, a faint sound drifted in through the open window. A soft woof, then a meow. Incomplete. Imperfect. But to some, it was the most honest sound they had ever heard. Emily Alcott was a well-behaved child, at least by her grandmother's standards. She knew how to say, "Yes, ma'am," and "Thank you," how to fold napkins into perfect triangles, and how to organize books alphabetically. Emily didn't do these things because she loved them. She did them to keep her grandmother pleased. In her years living with Bernice, she had learned that everything had its place, and her place was to never cause a stir. But Nova was unlike anything she had ever seen. The first time Emily saw her was through the white wooden fence behind Mr. Walter's house, where sunlight slanted gently through trees still dusted in snow. At first, Emily thought she was looking at a small dog, until Nova turned her head, and her amber eyes shimmered beneath the shadows. A cat, but not quite a cat. Nova was lying between Rex and Gia, her head resting on Toby's leg like a child curling into a sibling's arms. When a sound broke the stillness, all three dogs sprang to attention. And Nova did too, not a heartbeat slower, without a single cue. Emily held her breath. That afternoon she lied to her grandmother, saying she was heading to the library. But instead of turning right toward Main Street, she slipped around the garden, down a moss-lined trail, a narrow path where paw prints and a small circular track trailed side by side in the snow. Nova didn't flee when she saw her. She simply lifted her head, tilted an ear, then nestled back into Toby's chest, her look saying, "If you stay quiet, you're welcome to sit here." So Emily sat. She didn't reach out, didn't command, didn't call a name. She just watched and slowly began to understand. Nova wasn't simply living among dogs. She was living as one of them, not by barking, but by belonging. A week later, Emily brought her notebook, the one she usually used for writing poems. She wrote, "Nova is the first cat I've ever met who speaks through silence. She doesn't try to be like anyone else, but somehow, she makes everyone want to let her closer." She tucked the notebook beneath her coat and left it on Mr. Walter's porch like a secret gift. No name. No explanation. That night, Bernice Alcott brewed her tea as usual. Emily sat at the table, stirring milk into her cup with slow, thoughtful circles. Bernice asked, "Don't you think that cat is rather strange?" Emily didn't answer right away. She watched the steam rise from her cup, then said quietly, "No, Grandma. I think Nova's just trying to live kindly, with anyone willing to give her a chance." Bernice didn't reply, but something in her eyes shifted. Not agreement, just a silence wide enough for a new generation to begin speaking its heart. That night, the spring wind swept across the hill like a whisper passing between two seasons. Snow still clung to the roof, but not enough to conceal the new warmth stirring just beneath the earth. The air carried the scent of damp grass, aging timber, and something else, something quietly melting away after a long winter. Ravenhill slept. The whole town wrapped in silence, broken only by the rustling wind against window panes and the soft creaks of porch roofs bracing against the night. Walter's wooden house, perched alone at the edge of the hill, slept too. The fireplace had gone cold since early evening. The 3 Malinois lay in a crescent shape around the rug at the center of the living room. Nova curled up in the corner of an old armchair, her tail wrapped around her body like a silent ribbon. Upstairs, Walter slept in his second-floor bedroom, one hand clutched tightly around a faded photograph resting on his chest. An old picture of him and Eleanor sitting on the front porch, flanked by the original 3 dogs. He didn't dream often, but that night he dreamt of Eleanor calling his name. Downstairs, in the dark, a faint spark flickered, then vanished. Deep within the kitchen wall, an aging electrical wire had finally cracked. Moisture from the recent snowmelt had seeped into the brittle insulation, causing a small arc. Just enough heat, just enough time. The dry timber behind the wall began to smolder. There was no bang, no blaring alarm, only smoke. It began as a thin, ghost-like ribbon winding between the gaps in the wood. Then, slowly, it spread upward, rising toward the ceiling like a shapeless creature. It crept along the staircase, slipped into the hallway, thickened with each passing minute. The dogs didn't stir. They hadn't smelled it yet. But Nova opened her eyes. She didn't hiss. She didn't panic. She simply raised her head, her ears locked forward, zeroed in on a faint sound beneath the floorboards, a soft crackling, barely there. She lowered her body, stepping forward on silent paws, then stopped at the foot of the stairs. By now the smoke had reached the second floor, brushing against the wooden door behind which Walter still slept. Nova lifted her head, blinked repeatedly, eyes stinging from the burn. She didn't look back towards the pack. She didn't cry out. She raised both front paws and scratched at Walter's door. No response. The knocking was too faint. The smoke wasn't heavy enough yet, only enough to deepen his sleep. She jumped, tried the doorknob. Locked! She scratched harder. Tiny claws tore at old wood, again and again, each strike matching the beat of a heart, quick, desperate, soundless. When she could scratch no more, she began to make a sound. Not a meow, not a growl, a vibration, low, broken, without shape or volume. But from her throat came a pulse, a sound outside the language of cats. In his dream, Walter heard a voice, not clear, but close. He jolted upright. Smoke already painted the door in shades of gray. He coughed violently, stumbled to the knob, opened it. Nova was waiting, eyes glowing through the haze. She turned, ran, then stopped, looked back. Walter didn't speak, didn't think. He followed. They raced down the stairs. And just as his hand reached the front doorknob, behind him, the ceiling above the kitchen gave a long, deep crack, then erupted in flame, ripping the dark like a gash of light. He would never remember opening the door, or how his lungs felt like they were collapsing beneath a weightless wall of smoke. But what he would remember, long after, were those eyes. Small, round, burning silently in the dark. Nova. She stood at the top of the stairs, her back arched, front paws planted on the wood, poised to leap. Walter staggered toward her, but Nova didn't run. She stepped closer. Then suddenly, without warning, she leapt into his arms. She didn't claw like a panicked cat. Instead, she hooked a claw into the hem of Walter's nightshirt and tugged, softly, then looked at him once more, and ran. Just a few steps, then stopped, turned back, those eyes urgent, insistent. Walter still didn't fully understand. His heart hadn't yet caught up with the roar of fire growing beneath the floor, but the legs of an old firefighter moved on instinct before the mind could. He followed Nova. The staircase still held, but each step was beginning to warm beneath his feet. The edge of the kitchen floor had already caught fire. Red light flashed with every flicker, brighter, angrier. The 3 dogs were still lying down when Walter passed them, but they were rising now. Toby barked sharply. Rex stepped in front of Nova like a shield. Gia growled, low and tense. Nova didn't stop. She darted toward the front door. Walter rushed after her, hand grabbing the lock, now hot to the touch. His skin burned slightly, but the latch gave way. The door burst open. Cold air rushed in, dragging a wall of smoke behind it like a ghost forced from its hiding place. He shouted, voice hoarse, "Out! Now!" The 3 Malinois bolted first, but Nova didn't follow. She turned back, leapt up on Walter once more, this time tugging his sleeve toward the threshold. He dropped to one knee, scooped her into one arm, the other gripping the door frame. And together, they ran. Just as the porch behind them cracked, and part of the roof caved in with a deep groan, fire flaring like a breath from the lungs of a house once full of silence. Walter collapsed into the snow. Cold seeped through his clothes, but he didn't feel pain. Didn't feel fear. Only 2 things: his own breath, shaking, burning, and the slight, trembling weight pressed against his chest. Nova, still shaking, but not leaving. A cat. A cat that had pulled him from dream into survival. Walter buried his face into the smoke-scented fur on her back and whispered, "You said once, you wanted a cat." In the distance, the first sirens began to wail. But inside him, every alarm had already gone off. Nova hadn't just lived here. She had just saved the last thing he had left. The fire spread faster than expected. The kitchen roof collapsed minutes after Walter and the pack escaped. Spring wind turned into a torch-fed breath. Snow underfoot melted into gray puddles. On the hill, the flames painted the trees red. Walter coughed hard, slumped against a rock near the path. The 3 Malinois formed a perimeter around him, growling instinctively, ready to charge back in if he so much as lifted a hand. But none of them saw Nova. He shouted, voice cracking, "Nova!" No response. Then, a sharp sound tore through the smoke, like a short hiss, followed by a hoarse, uneven bark. Not a meow, not a yelp, something in between. Walter looked up. In the second-story window, where flames licked through the wooden seams, Nova appeared. A silhouette rimmed by firelight, framed like a living sketch in a canvas of ruin. She stood there, back arched, front paws braced, eyes locked on Walter. Then, she jumped. Her small body sliced through the smoke, falling like a torn piece of sky. For a heartbeat, the world held still. Then the thump of her landing, heavy for her size, no cry of pain, just a roll, a stagger. And then, she ran, straight down the hill, toward the flickering red lights curving up the road. And in the middle of ash and thawed snow, Nova raised her head, and barked, Not loud, not clean, but clear. In the lead fire engine, a young firefighter named Sean, riding shotgun, turned to his partner. "Was that a cat?" The driver hit the brakes. The truck lurched slightly. The whole team jumped out, eyes scanning ahead. And there, centered in the snow like a sentinel from another world, stood a small gray cat, barking at them through the smoke. Walter, still clutching his chest, whispered, "She's calling for you." The scene was a living paradox. A small, smoke-scorched cat, fur singed and heavy with soot, standing guard between 3 dogs, her eyes locked on the smoldering doorway, and still trying to make a sound. Not a cry for help, a call to alert. No one in the fire crew spoke during that first minute. Then someone finally broke the silence. "That cat, she's acting like a rescue dog." Sean nodded, eyes never leaving Nova. She's acting like a member. That night, no one knew exactly where Nova had learned those instincts. There had been no training course, no commands, but everyone could see the truth. When Nova barked, it wasn't just sound. It was presence. It was declaration. That in this family she wasn't just a cat. She was the signal in the smoke, the one no one expected, but exactly who they needed when time had boiled down to breath. When the final flames died, only the scent of smoke remained, lingering above charred beams and half-burned stone. Ravenhill still hadn't woken. The town had slept through the event, as if fate had chosen just one place to hold all its fire that night, the small house atop the hill, and the lives that had sheltered within it. Walter sat on a cold stone step, wrapped in an emergency blanket borrowed from the fire truck. His body shook, not from cold, but from something deeper. A tremor in the chest that felt like it might break him open, though his tears came soft, slow, and quiet as morning dew. Nova lay curled in his lap, swaddled in a firefighter's jacket. She didn't cry. She didn't stir. Her tiny chest rose and fell in steady rhythm. Her eyes remained closed, but her ears twitched gently, like they were listening for something, not from this world. The 3 Malinois formed a ring around him. Gia no longer barked. Toby lay stretched out, his head resting on Walter's foot. Rex, the eldest, stared skyward, silent, as if standing watch over something more sacred than flame. Walter looked at each creature beside him, each carrying a piece of memory, a fragment of Eleanor. Then he looked at Nova. The wind brushed through his white hair. And he whispered, voice trembling, surprised it even came out as sound. "Eleanor, you were right." A stillness followed. Only the faint crackle of embers whispered from the ash near the old porch. "A cat can save a wandering heart." He placed a hand gently on Nova's back, the way he used to rest it on Eleanor's belly during the coldest nights, when the dream of a small cat had been the one thing that made her smile in winter. Nova shifted, not to pull away, but to press herself closer against his chest, as if she understood that this moment was not just survival. It was the way home. Walter looked up to the sky. The clouds had cleared. Above Ravenhill, the heavens opened into a band of deep purple, and right there, in the center, a faint star shone, small, but unmistakably lit. He smiled, for the first time since the day Eleanor left, and pulled Nova closer. "Welcome home, my little star." That morning the Alcott home was unusually quiet. Pale spring sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft light over the mahogany dining table. On it, Bernice's favorite teacup still steamed gently, untouched. She wasn't drinking. She was watching Emily. The 10-year-old sat across from her, still in her nightgown, faint white cat hairs clinging to the fabric. A slice of toast rested in her hand, but her eyes were distant, holding something back, unsure if it should be spoken aloud. "Did you have a dream?" Bernice asked, voice even. careful not to bridge the distance too quickly between generations. Emily looked up. Her eyes were strangely lit. Not excited, not frightened, but touched with the quiet knowing of someone who had just wandered through a dream too real to shake off. "Nova turned into light," she said slowly, as if recounting something she was absolutely certain had happened. Bernice frowned. "Nova? That cat?" Emily nodded. "But she wasn't a cat anymore. She had light around her, like stardust, Grandma. And then she ran into a burning house." The kitchen seemed to slow. The gas stove ticked softly. The wall clock kept steady rhythm. "There was someone trapped inside," Emily continued. "Nova pulled at their clothes. No one else went in. Just her, and the light. Then she pulled the person out." "Who was it?" Bernice asked quietly, her fingers tightening slightly around the handle of her teacup. Emily met her gaze, like she'd known that question was coming. "I think it was Mr. Walter." The words fell like a dry leaf onto still water. Bernice didn't respond for a long time. The tea cooled. The morning light shifted across the window frame. Since the fire at Walter's house, she hadn't spoken directly about it. Though she'd been the first to draft a formal letter of protest, the most resolute voice on the behavioral deviation of animals, she hadn't said a word about Nova's actions, because reason held no space for what she had seen with her own eyes. The fire crew's footage. A cat standing in the snow, barking. A cat who lifted her head like she was giving orders. And now, a child who dreamed of her as light in the fire. Bernice drew in a long breath. Her aging heart felt suddenly heavy. Not because she was wrong, but because something she had once been so sure of was beginning to fracture in ways she couldn't hold back. "Dreams are just imagination, Emily," she said, but her voice was quieter now. Lower. Emily didn't answer. She only looked down and continued her breakfast. But inside the child, Nova was no longer just a cat. She was something else. Not in textbooks, not in the Women's Circle rulebook. She was a light in the smoke. Bernice Alcott had never taken a formal document lightly. As president of the Ravenhill Women's Circle for 18 consecutive years, she had ensured that every letter, every meeting note, every spring flower bulletin was perfectly formatted, even once correcting the mayor's punctuation because his period was too close to the right margin. So that morning, when the mail carrier handed her an envelope stamped with the town hall seal, she brewed a fresh pot of tea, sat upright, used her late husband's silver letter opener, and unfolded the document with the solemnity of someone preparing to receive the rightful confirmation of the world she believed still functioned in order. The letter contained only 2 lines. "Dear Mrs. Bernice Alcott, after reviewing your report and consulting current municipal regulations, we respond as follows. There is no ordinance prohibiting a cat from living like a dog. Sincerely, the Ravenhill Community Coordination Office." She read the letter 3 times. The first time she squinted, convinced she had misread it. The second, she wondered if the letter had been delivered to the wrong person. The third time. She sank back into her chair, her brow folding into creases never seen when she was out in public. "There is no regulation," she mouthed. "Not a pending review. Not subject to reassessment. Not even currently under investigation. Just simply, there is no regulation prohibiting it. A cat could live like a dog. A cat could respond to sirens, stand guard by the door, and bark. And not a single line in the law said that was wrong. Her reasoning, the very bedrock of her identity, once firm as the stone foundations of the northern hill houses, wavered ever so slightly. For the first time in her life, Bernice had to admit a truth no statute could tidy, no tulip row in her garden could straighten. Not all order could be governed by rules. Some belonged to the heart. She looked out the window. At the far end of the sunlit street, Walter Reed was stepping onto his porch, a coffee pot in hand. Behind him came Rex, Toby, Gia, and Nova. Nova didn't walk at the center of the pack. She didn't try to mimic the others. But somehow, each tiny stride, each glance toward Walter, each flick of her ear at distant sounds, fell into rhythm with the rest. Not forced, not copied, just belonging. Bernice let out a long sigh. The letter on her table hadn't insulted her, but it left a small scratch, a scratch she knew would never scar properly unless she looked directly at it. There is no regulation that forbids a cat from living like a dog. And just as importantly, there is no regulation that forbids an old woman from changing her mind, especially when that change begins in the dream of a grandchild. At first, it was only passing glances. Early market-goers would spot Nova perched beside Rex, Toby, and Gia outside the town pharmacy. No leashes, no restraints. Yet the four creatures, like a silent patrol, sat neatly beneath the awning's shade. Nova, the smallest, sat in the center. Her eyes squinted from the sunlight, ears upright as if tuned to a frequency no human could detect. Then, in the afternoons, when the fire station ran siren drills from the southern end of town, the children began pointing and shouting, "Look, the cat jumped on the truck." And it was true. Nova, whether drawn by familiarity or something deeper, was always the first to bolt toward the big red engine. She would leap onto the step with delicate ease, as though she had been born to do just that. And every time, instead of meowing, she let out a rasp, half bark, half croak, then flicked her tail. The rumor spread faster than winter winds across Ravenhill. "That cat thinks it's a dog." "No, it is a dog, in the body of a cat." Or maybe it's Eleanor's spirit come back. Didn't she once say she dreamt of raising a cat? No one was quite sure what was true, but somehow, to each person, Nova came to represent a missing piece they had never been able to name. To the elderly, she was proof that one could change without losing oneself. To the children, she stood for freedom, the right to become what you choose, not what you were labeled. And to those who had lived within rules all their lives, she became a question. If a cat could live like a dog and still love deeply, could we soften the way we look at each other? At the bakery by the square, someone placed a little dish marked Nova's Corner. Each afternoon she'd pass by, licking up a few crumbs left behind. Gus, the grumpy shop owner, had begun recounting stories about the soldier cat to every new customer who walked in. At the schoolhouse, Emily, now finally allowed to mention Nova without her grandmother objecting, brought drawings of the cat to class. Her friends gathered around, curious. "She really guards the door?" Emily would nod, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Nova didn't know she was changing anything. She simply lived, guided by breath, by the rhythm of guarding alongside 3 dogs, by running toward the sound that asked for help. And it was this way of living, quiet, unannounced, that made Nova into a symbol, not of difference, but of acceptance. Ravenhill slowly began to stir as the snow melted. People swept porches, replanted tulips, repainted windowsills. The small town exhaled its first warm breath after a long winter, and everyone had a story to tell about Nova. About how she once lay across the threshold of a shoe shop, stopping a child from darting into the road. About the way she dipped her head whenever sirens wailed, as if honoring something deeper than instinct. But amidst the curious glances, the whispered stories, and half-skeptical smiles, there was one man who said nothing at all. Walter Reed. He lived as he always had, waking early, brewing coffee, feeding the dogs, walking the forest edge. He didn't attend the spring festival. He never commented on the townsfolk's chatter. Sometimes he paused near the marketplace, but only to watch before quietly moving on. People had started calling him Nova's man, but he neither accepted nor denied it. To him, Nova wasn't a spectacle. She wasn't a miracle. Nova was the first light after a long night. In the small house at the edge of the hill, where the fireplace still burned every evening and the window stayed cracked just enough to hear the pine wind breathing, Nova had her place, right in the center of the 3 oversized fur beds that belonged to Rex, Toby, and Gia. She slept curled up, sometimes shifting gently when she dreamed. Each time she stirred, Walter would lift his eyes from the old wooden chair by the window, eyes that no longer looked as clouded as before. He didn't watch like one observes something strange. He watched as if he were listening to a melody returning after years of silence. One rainy spring night, Walter opened a small leather-bound notebook and began to write. Not a journal, just a few scattered notes. Nova eats ginger cookies, doesn't like cinnamon. Toby lets her sit in front of the fan. Rex doesn't mind. Gia licks her face when she snores too loud. He paused, stared at the words, then nodded gently to himself. Maybe Eleanor had been right after all. That a broken heart doesn't need to be stitched back together. It only needs something warm enough to keep beating. Not noise, not explanation, just presence. And in that moment, among the soft firelight, the rhythmic breathing of 3 old dogs, and the curled shape of Nova like a perfect silent note, Walter felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He wasn't entirely alone anymore. No one thought spring would arrive like this. After an unusually long winter, the snow in Ravenhill had always known how to melt with grace, dripping slowly from rooftops onto the stone slopes below. But this year, a strange, hot wind blew in from the west, sudden and uninvited. Within 2 days, the sub-zero cold gave way to damp mornings and heavy noon air soaked with the smell of wet earth, as if the land itself, held down too long, had begun to cry out. On the northern hills above town, the ice began to break. Not in patches like every other year, but all at once. Giant slabs that had lain dormant through months of frost suddenly collapsed into roadside gullies, swept away by rising streams. Rain from lingering storms up in the highlands joined the meltwater, splitting like ruptured veins. These waters did not follow paths. They carved their own. From tiny channels into creeks, from creeks into ponds, and from there into the lowest arms of Ravenhill, where wooden cabins still clung to the edge of town. The Ravenhill Weather Bureau issued an early warning, but few believed a true flash flood could happen. The town sat high, surrounded by hills and forest, and for nearly 30 years, no one had ever had to evacuate because of water. But this time, the water came from every direction. Gutters spilled over like miniature waterfalls. Drains swallowed mud in choking gulps and still couldn't keep up. And then, within a single afternoon, the far end of town, where the last winter cabins stood occupied, became completely cut off. The dirt road that wound from the town center to those distant homes, including the cabin where Bernice Alcott and her granddaughter were staying, vanished beneath a swirling current of brown, turbulent water. Up in the sky, rescue helicopters remained grounded by gusting winds. The emergency crews were stuck at lower elevations. In the temporary command center set up in the square, one responder pointed to the map and froze mid-sentence. "The last cabin, the one with little Nina, it's right at the confluence point." Silence fell over the room. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew what it meant. In Ravenhill, when the waters rose, people didn't wait. The phone rang at 4:12 that afternoon, just as Bernice Alcott stood at the window, both hands wrapped tightly around a steaming cup of tea. She had never liked wet weather, and liked even less the feeling of being unable to control anything. She had once been a school teacher, once the coordinator for the Winter Festival, the president of the Women's Council for 12 consecutive years. She believed in plans, in timetables, in neatly printed lists. But that phone call unraveled everything. Mrs. Alcott, the last cabin down in Cedar Hollow has been isolated by water. Little Nina is still inside. Everything after that moment became a blur. There were the sounds, water slapping against the wooden steps, a neighbor shouting from somewhere down the street, "The road's gone!" The distant wail of a siren, not approaching, not receding, just hovering somewhere in the stillness. But Bernice remembered one thing clearly: the face of her granddaughter Emily as the child wrapped her arms tightly around her neck, eyes trembling, not from fear, but from something deeper: helplessness. "She's still in there, Grandma. Nova will save her." Bernice didn't answer. She pulled her coat tighter and rushed onto the porch. And for the first time since she moved to Ravenhill, she felt it. This town was no longer safe. On the other side of town, the Ravenhill Rescue Center was tightening like a fist. A wide topographic map was spread across the old wooden table, red markers strung together like wounds spreading across a body. The Alcott cabin, the last home on the land once considered the safest high ground in town, was now completely surrounded by fast-moving water. The logistics officer leaned over the table, voice low. "There's no way to get a boat in time. The winds are too strong, the current's unstable. Any craft we send will flip before it gets there." Someone else added, hesitant, "The attic of that house. It's only half a meter above water level. If it rises any more." No one finished the sentence. A photo on the wall, Bernice, Nina, and Emily smiling in front of the summer cabin, had become a cruel reminder. The child, Nina, was only 6, quiet in every gathering, her laughter only blooming when she saw dogs run. The same girl who once held Nova's paw during a rainy afternoon and whispered, "This cat can hear your heart." 1 hour passed, then another. Weather bulletins shifted minute by minute. Helicopters remained grounded. Every known path was underwater. Inside the flickering light of an old television, Bernice Alcott stood still, her lips moving in a voiceless prayer. "Someone, please." Across the valley, in a darkened cabin whose fireplace had just gone out with the power, Walter sat motionless beside the window. Outside, the snow had turned to rivers, the runoff from the hills rushing toward Ravenhill like a broken spirit, furious and unsoothed. The radio crackled on and off with static-laced warnings. Names blurred through interference, but one pierced the white noise again and again. "Bernice Alcott, 6-year-old girl, trapped in inaccessible cabin." Walter didn't speak. He looked out at the blur of rain and snowmelt. Then he looked to the 3 dogs lying near the door. Rex, calm but alert, was already up. Toby stood with ears locked forward, letting out a short, sharp bark, the kind he only made when given a mission. Gia stepped closer and rested her head on Walter's knee, as if she too had heard what hadn't yet been spoken aloud. Nova sat slightly apart. She did not bark. She did not growl. She simply watched him, eyes deep, steady, silent, like the surface of a lake right before a storm. Walter rose. He reached for the old coat he used to wear on emergency runs years ago. The fabric had faded, the edges were worn, but the stains held memories that no amount of washing could erase. He opened the cedar chest and pulled out the weatherproof harness. Rex lowered his head. Toby barked once. Gia leapt to her feet, tail wagging furiously. And Nova came forward, positioning herself beside Rex without a word, without a cue, as if she had always belonged. No one had to say it. No one had to explain. "We don't wait. Not in Ravenhill," Walter murmured, his voice folding into the sound of wind rattling the window panes. "If that were Eleanor's granddaughter in there, you wouldn't wait either. On the back of his old pickup, he laid down a water-resistant tarp. Rex and Toby leapt up first. Gia waited until Nova climbed aboard, then followed. All four settled low to the surface, silent. Walter climbed into the driver's seat. The engine coughed, then rumbled to life. His hands trembled slightly on the wheel, not from age, but from something larger, the fear of losing one more innocent life. They turned off the main road, past a barricade set up by emergency services. Walter didn't ask for permission. He didn't apologize. He only nodded at the young man standing post. Brian, the same boy Walter had pulled from a fire on the southern ridge back in 2003. Brian said nothing. He simply opened the gate and whispered, "Good luck, Mr. Reed. Nova knows what to do." The truck pressed forward, tires fighting against sludge and runoff, pushing through terrain already claimed by the flood. The side roads had turned to clay pits, the wind slicing sideways like cold salt against the skin. But in the last cabin of Cedar Valley, where a little girl was still waiting, perhaps the light had not yet gone out. And perhaps that light had a name written in the stars. Nova stood up, placing both paws on the truck window. Her breath misted the glass. She didn't blink. She knew. She was ready. The rushing water tore apart every calculation. By the time Walter and the dogs reached the edge of the forest, where the earth softened and the streams no longer flowed but surged, the final cabin in the valley had become little more than a blur of wood and shadow through the curtain of rain. There was no path left. The water had risen above an adult's knees and kept climbing, devouring the old trail like a ravenous beast. Walter parked the truck nearly 100 meters away. He could go no further. The wind ripped his hat sideways, the spray slapping his face like a dozen cold hands. Rex and Toby began barking. Gia whined sharply, claws scratching the truck's door. And Nova didn't make a sound. She looked at the storm. Then she leapt down. Nova didn't bark. She was the first to leap out. No hesitation, no command needed. Walter called after her, voice sharp with panic. "Nova, no, stop!" But she didn't. Nova charged into the water as if her whole body had been born for this one moment. The flood swelled around her, slamming into her small feline frame. But she didn't sink. All those days playing in the rescue center pool with Rex and Toby, all those times she'd leapt into the truck at the sound of a siren, none of it had been games. It had all been training. Walter ran alongside the flooded trail, Rex and Gia at his heels, heart pounding so hard he could barely breathe. He called out again, but the wind swallowed everything. Nova fought her way toward the cabin. The front door was fully submerged. The first-floor windows had vanished under the waterline. But she didn't try to enter there. Nova wasn't reckless. She circled to the back, where a section of the metal roofing had peeled off during an earlier storm, leaving just enough of a gap near the attic. Somehow she leapt high enough to land on the slanted roof. Rain slicked every surface, but Nova clawed at the splintered edges, anchoring herself in the cracks. She slid down, then climbed again. Once, twice, a third time. She made it. She slipped through the narrow opening and disappeared into the dark. Inside the cabin, Nina lay curled beneath a damp blanket near the angled ceiling. Water had risen to the second floor. Cold crept into everything. Wind howled through every crack in the wood. When Nova dropped onto the attic floor, the little girl looked up, eyes wide, stunned but not afraid. "Nova?" The soaked gray cat stepped forward. She didn't meow. She didn't need to. She simply sat down, meeting Nina's gaze. Then inched closer, gently pressing her head into the girl's trembling hand. As Nina reached out, Nova turned, a silent signal. In the dim light leaking through the torn roof, Nina saw a tail swish softly. She didn't know why, but she followed. Nova led the way, slow, careful, one step at a time. When they reached the sliver of light, she stopped, turned around, and pressed her entire warm body against Nina's side, wrapping around her. The cold didn't leave. But inside that quiet, living shield, without blankets, without words, Nina knew she was still alive. By the time the rescue crew broke through the cabin's roof using a precision crane, the first thing they saw wasn't debris or ruin. It was a small gray cat, trembling but unmoving, wrapped fully around a child, like a living blanket cradling the smallest soul in the storm. "My God," one firefighter whispered. "Is that a cat?" Walter didn't say a word. He dropped to his knees and opened his arms as Nova stepped out from Nina's embrace. Her eyes didn't gleam with victory, but something deeper. The quiet of a duty fulfilled. The photo was taken by a rescue drone. Accidental, but unforgettable. In the frame, blurred slightly by wind, the roof tilted like a survivor from battle. Rain still fell. Water still pressed close, a murky wall around them. But in the attic's corner, captured forever, a small, soaked cat curled protectively around a little girl. Not out of instinct, not for warmth, but with intent, as if in that moment Nova was no longer a cat. Not even a dog. She was something else entirely. The final shield of courage. No one remembered who took the shot. But the image soon appeared on the Ravenhill Rescue Team's social media, captioned with just 5 words, "Not all heroes bark." The photo spread, from this small mountain town to the cities beyond, to skeptics, to strangers, to those who had never believed a cat could ever do something like that. At the Ravenhill Community Center, a large print of the image was mounted beside the board titled, "In Honor of Those Who Saved Lives." Nova was the first non-canine to be included. Emily, the girl who once dreamed of light, was the first to touch the photo. She whispered to her grandmother, "I know why she did it. Not because she thought she was a dog, but because she knew no one else could." Bernice said nothing. But her hand rested on her granddaughter's shoulder, the first time she didn't correct her posture or remind her to sit up straight. As for Walter, after all the noise, all the news, all the invitations for interviews that he quietly refused, he simply folded the newspaper and placed it in the drawer beside Eleanor's old notebook. Then turned to Nova, now curled by the fireplace, asleep as if nothing had happened. "You were someone's blanket in a storm," he whispered. "And sometimes, that's all a life really needs." After the storm, Ravenhill no longer gleamed white like a winter blanket. Instead, the land wore the color of damp earth, the scent of rotting wood, and deep, muddy scars etched along every hillside. It felt like a town that had just broken a fever. Peace returned, but not lightly. It came with a heaviness, as if every breath taken now had to be counted, saved. Walter came back to his house on an early summer morning, not to rest, but to pack. Outside the gate, the mailbox was stuffed full, envelopes soaked and curled at the corners, most unreadable. But one cream-colored envelope remained dry, wedged deep inside. No stamp, no sender's name, just one printed line, sharp and emotionless. Notice of reclamation, lot RV47 2B. Walter didn't move. He didn't need to open it. He understood. For the first time in his life, he found printed letters colder than battlefield smoke. His home, the place where 3 dogs had learned to sleep without fear, where Eleanor once arranged flowers by the window, where Nova had first made that half-bark, half-meow sound, no longer belonged to him. The letter was clear. Following flood damage, official assessment concludes the foundation is structurally compromised and ineligible for repair. Property rights are hereby revoked for purposes of ecological resort development. And then, one final line. Clean. Surgical. Former occupants are required to remove all personal belongings within 14 days. Walter stepped across the threshold, each footfall a silent beat. The house still stood, though the walls bore a deeper shade from moisture. The guitar on the wall hadn't fallen. The window where Nova once sat, gazing into the valley, remained half open, casting a faint feline-shaped shadow across the aging floor. But everything had changed. He opened the cabinet beneath the coffee table, the one Eleanor used to store jars of berry preserves for summer. Nothing remained, just the slow creak of the wooden door, like a sigh too old to finish. He sat down on the fabric armchair, the one faded with years, and held the notebook Eleanor once filled with half-poems and observations. The last page was yellowed now, but the words remained. If one day we lose everything, as long as there's a small creature sleeping by your feet, you still have a home. Walter looked up. No one there. Just morning light tilting through the window, as if even the sunlight were looking for somewhere safe to land. Outside, the 3 dogs lay curled in a crescent along the front step. And Nova. Nova nestled into his lap, her body folded tight, trying to share warmth without a fireplace. Walter whispered, unsure if he was speaking to himself or to Eleanor in memory. But if there's nowhere left to go, where does that warmth go? It was the beginning of a journey no one had trained him for. Not one through fire, not one through flood waters, but through the locked doors of reality. He had few options. In the first 3 days after receiving the notice, Walter made call after call to senior assistance centers, low-income housing near Ravenhill, even non-profit groups that had reached out after the storm, and nearly every answer sounded the same. We're sorry, but pets are not permitted under our current policy. 3 large dogs. What breed, sir? Malinois? Ah, unfortunately that doesn't suit our shared living environment. You say your cat barks? I'm sorry, but we require medical certification or a behavioral evaluation on file. The more he called, the more it felt like his heart had turned into that mailbox from earlier, filled with rejection, but empty when all he needed was one word that meant stay. Walter had faced fire. He'd once run into a burning house with a faulty oxygen tank strapped to his back. But nothing had ever clutched his chest the way a center worker's voice did over the phone that morning. The dogs can go to the rescue shelter. The cat, that's up to you. As for yourself, sir, there's a state-run facility 140 kilometers out. Separate. Piece by piece. Walter sat at the worn wooden table, eyes fixed on the quiet lives scattered throughout his house. Each animal a heartbeat he'd memorized over countless nights. Rex, the oldest, most solemn, had a habit of curling against Walter's back, as if shielding his heart from the cold. Toby, sharp-eyed, ever alert, would silently lock eyes with him whenever thunder cracked outside. Gia, the youngest and most wary, had been the first to reach out a paw to touch Nova the day they met. And Nova didn't need description. With eyes closed, Walter could still name every spot in the house where that cat might be. The issue wasn't shelter. It was that no shelter had room enough for what he called a pack. Walter tried listing options. It had been too long since he'd written with a shaky hand. But every line ended up crossed out. Split them up? Find adopters? Temporary placement? Leave behind the one who adapts best? Number every option left a gap, a silence too loud. That night he didn't sleep, not from the cold, not from back pain, but because for the first time in his life, Walter felt like he was the leftover piece in the life he had spent so long holding together. And as dawn broke, he sat on the porch. Nova jumped into his lap, curling without worry. The three dogs formed a silent crescent around them. He spoke, not looking at any of them. "We don't have a place to call home anymore, but I'll find a way, so that each of you has a place where fear doesn't follow." When 4 days passed and not a single option remained, Walter did the one thing he had always feared most. He divided the pack. He did it slowly, not because he needed time, but because they did. Because dogs trust calm, and they needed to believe nothing terrible was happening. Rex, the oldest, went to a veterinary clinic on the south side of Ravenhill. Dr. Hank, a former medic, was the only person Walter trusted to understand that Rex didn't need medication. He needed peace. "He used to lie beside me every night I couldn't sleep," Walter said, rubbing behind Rex's ear. "Now, I hope you'll let him sleep through." Gia, the youngest, went to the animal shelter that had once served as a flood evacuation hub. A young volunteer named Lori, who had helped rescue countless wounded animals, agreed to care for her. "She needs room to run," Walter instructed, "and someone who won't try to pet her before she's ready. Just wait. She'll trust again." Toby, the most alert and intuitive, was entrusted to little Nina, the girl who had once clung to Nova like a living blanket during the storm. Nina didn't ask questions. She just wrapped her arms around Toby and whispered, "I'll tell him my dreams every night, like he used to guard me from the bad ones." Toby didn't look back when the car pulled away, but the single flick of his tail said everything. "I'm okay." Only Nova remained. And Walter had no more choices. Ordinary adopters didn't understand her, and no one was ready to handle a cat who could stand guard, who perked up at fire truck sirens, and who barked at strangers. Bernice Alcott was the only one who might take her. Not because she liked cats, but because she had once written a letter demanding Nova be removed from proper society. And perhaps, because of that, she was the only one who understood. Not everything strange is wrong. They didn't say much. It was just an ordinary afternoon when Walter brought Nova over. Bernice Alcott opened the door, not dressed in her usual pearls and pressed skirts, but in an old sweater, sleeves rolled up, still damp from scrubbing the floor. Nova jumped down onto the porch. No fear, no hesitation. Bernice crouched, meeting the cat's eyes for a long moment. Then she exhaled gently. "There's a chair by the fireplace," she said. "Not big, but enough for someone small who knows how to share warmth." Walter nodded. Before he turned to leave, he said only one thing. "She doesn't need anyone to make promises, just someone who stays." Then he walked away. He didn't look back, because if he did, he would see Nova following him, then stopping at the edge of the porch, right at the step where Eleanor used to stand every evening, waiting for him to return from the firehouse. That evening, Ravenhill was bathed in a rare golden light. Each corner of the town held a familiar scent, of dry straw, of yellowed paper, of fires long since extinguished. But in Walter's heart, what caught flame wasn't loss anymore. It was the quiet faith that all the scattered pieces that once belonged together would find their way home again. Bernice Alcott's house sat on the last curve of Clover Street, where the slope dipped just enough for morning sun to arrive late. Snow lingered longer there than anywhere else in Ravenhill. For years, her house had been known for its pristine appearance, a kind of order so precise it bordered on coldness. The white fence never showed a speck of rust. Lavender bushes were trimmed to uniform height. Curtains hung just ajar, enough to let in light, never enough to fade the furniture. But in recent days, something had broken that meticulous rhythm. A cat. Nova. Since the moment Walter left, Nova hadn't touched the food Bernice prepared. Not the gently steamed salmon, not the warmed milk served in a porcelain bowl lined with gold. She hadn't curled on the plush bed by the window, nor wandered into the kitchen, the warmest room in the house. She simply sat, right at the edge of the fireplace hearth, facing the tall glass window overlooking the snow-covered street. She didn't fidget, didn't blink much, as if the world beyond that window held the only thing that still mattered, and everything else was just a temporary arrangement. Morning, she sat. Afternoon, she sat. At night, when Bernice turned off the lights, Nova still didn't move. Only her eyes changed. Bernice had always taken pride in her ability to read the expressions of living creatures. She could tell when a dog was pretending to be obedient, when a cat was manipulating affection, when a person smiled politely but meant none of it. But Nova had something in her eyes Bernice couldn't label. It wasn't sadness, not anger, not resignation. It was an unspoken kind of waiting. Nova didn't scratch, didn't meow, didn't do anything a cat might do to cause trouble. And yet her silence had become the loudest sound in a house that was already quiet. On the third morning, before the sun had risen, Bernice brought a bowl of hot soup and placed it in front of Nova, untouched again. She straightened her back, but when she spoke, her voice came out softer than usual. "You can't just wait forever." Nova didn't turn. Bernice stepped closer, reaching out to stroke her back, something she always did with feral cats at the shelter to gauge their trust. But her hand stopped mid-air, not from fear, but because she realized Nova wasn't reacting like a cat. She was reacting like someone who had seen war, not starving in body, but in spirit, locked behind doors no one could open. That night, Bernice called Walter. Really called. Not just in her head like she had for the past 2 days. "She's not eating," she said, voice trembling. "She's fading." Walter didn't respond right away, but his breath came through the silence, a quiet sound that said he understood something Bernice hadn't yet put into words. "She's waiting," he whispered. And just then, outside Bernice's door, there was the faint sound of scratching. The phone rang again at 3:14 a.m. Walter was still awake. He sat in the small, makeshift room tucked inside the back of the rescue center. No more armchair, no more steady paw steps of Toby pacing the hall, only the smell of fresh paint and the hiss of wind curling through the cracks in the window frame. I'm sorry to call this late," Bernice's voice came, broken, like her throat had been filled with dust. "Nova's not eating, she's not sleeping, and I don't know what to do." Walter didn't speak right away. For a split second it felt like Eleanor was calling, in that same brave voice that tried to sound firm, but couldn't hide the trembling underneath. "Is your porch light still on?" he asked quietly. "Yes." "Leave it. If anything happens, she'll find the light." At dawn, snow had gathered on the windowsill, a soft dusting like broken chalk. Bernice rose earlier than usual, brewed a pot of tea, and stood silently before the tall glass window. And then she froze. Just beyond the porch steps, lying silently in the snow, was a large figure, dark fur, slow, steady breathing, no barking, no movement, just lying there, like a statue carved not of stone, but of quiet patience. It was Rex, the old dog, steady and calm, the one Walter once called, with a gentle kind of pride, his silent guardian. His legs were dusted in white, snow clinging to the fur like salt to an old coat. But his eyes remained open, not drowsy, not lost, just calm, as if he had arrived at exactly the right place, at exactly the right time. Bernice opened the door. Cold air rushed in, slicing across the floor, but Rex didn't stir. Inside, Nova lifted her head. And in that instant, the moment her gaze locked onto him, the stillness in her eyes shattered, like an old lamp flickering back to life in a long-abandoned room. She stood, walked slowly towards the door. Bernice didn't stop her. She simply stepped aside, allowing the two beings, one old, one small, to meet in that quiet space where house met porch, where warmth met winter. Rex didn't lower his head. Nova didn't flinch. It was just a touch. Nose to nose, fur to fur. No sound at all, but the feeling of connection echoed so loudly it filled the doorway, pressed gently against the heart of anyone who witnessed it. Nova circled Rex once, then lay down beside him. Rex curled his legs in, wrapping his tail over, like a worn old coat being draped gently over the shoulders of a friend who'd finally made it home. 2 breaths, 2 rhythms, melted into the morning fog, like a bridge rebuilt after long, aching silence. Bernice, still standing in the doorway, raised a hand slowly to her chest. In all her years as chairwoman of the Ravenhill Women's Association, through dozens of letters, through hundreds of speeches, she had never seen anything that so completely took her words away. No phrasing could capture this. No rulebook could define it. Only one thing was unmistakably clear. A creature had crossed miles of cold and silence to reach another, not from instinct, but from something far beyond logic, the quiet, undeniable need for one another. Rex tucked his legs tighter, his tail forming a shield, a familiar warmth for an old friend. 2 heartbeats, softened by frost, became one quiet promise beneath the soft blue dawn. And then, in the hush no one dared disturb, Nova raised her head. The small cat placed one paw on Rex's shoulder, leaned forward, and rested her head fully against his chest, where the fur was thickest, warmest. No growl, no hesitation, no performance, only surrender, not to dominance, but to trust. That simple gesture made Bernice raise her hand to her mouth. Not out of fear, but because the emotion rose too fast, too real, too beautiful to contain. A moment later, Rex leaned forward and gently licked Nova's forehead. A slow, deliberate motion. Not instinct, not routine grooming, but a ritual, as if returning something that had once been lost. No one in town witnessed it. But had someone happened to walk past Bernice Alcott's porch that morning, they would have stopped. Stopped to see 2 creatures, once believed incompatible, now curled together, as if the cold itself melted at the warmth of trust. The scene didn't need storytelling. It was captured by Emily, Bernice's granddaughter, who snapped a photo from the wooden stairwell and quietly posted it online with a caption that read, "Not a dog, not a cat, just 2 hearts that found each other after everything else fell apart." The image didn't explode across the internet. It drifted slowly, like morning mist. But every comment, every share carried the same echo. If these 2 can lie together like that, maybe there's still hope for the world. And just as the sun rose, its first light cut through the frosted glass, resting on the 2 bodies curled gently on the porch snow, as if even nature wished to preserve the moment. A portrait not painted with color, but with pulse. Bernice stood there for a long time, one hand resting on the old wooden doorframe, her gaze fixed on the 2 figures resting at the edge of the home. She didn't know where the wind came from, whether from the hills, the peaks, or some forgotten silence she hadn't dared to enter in years. But she felt it brushing the corners of her eyes, carrying a damp chill that wasn't from the frost. It was the kind that only came from tears no longer held back. Her throat tightened. For years, for decades, she had believed in order, in boundaries between species, roles, decorum. She believed everything had its rightful place: humans, dogs, cats, emotions, obligations. But now, a cat was sleeping against an old dog like a youngest child who had just found her long-lost brother. And every theory she had once trusted fell silent. "There are things," she whispered, not to anyone in particular, but perhaps to the part of herself that still needed permission to feel. that simply can't be separated. Her back trembled slightly. Shoulders that once stood firm in committee meetings, that had held strong through every formal rebuttal and letter of protest, now lowered, not out of shame, but from the soft weight of a truth rediscovered. "Maybe," she murmured, her eyes drifting back to Nova, who now rested one paw across Rex's back, both sleeping in a peace too tender to disturb. "I was wrong." No one answered. There were no affirmations, no applause. Only one thing became certain: the lightness in her chest. As if what she had just admitted hadn't cost her her dignity, but returned to her a sliver of humanity long sealed away. That night, Bernice didn't return to the unfinished petition on her desk. Instead, she took a small scrap of paper and, in plain handwriting, wrote, "When a cat learns to protect like a dog, and a human learns to love without needing to fully understand, perhaps the world is learning how to be better." She folded the note and placed it beside the window where the moonlight touched the edge of the sill. And that night, Nova slept once more, curled next to Rex, without fear, without asking, without proving anything, just present. That spring, the town square was transformed into a festival ground. Once a wartime supply depot, then a makeshift parking lot, it now wore a new skin of fabric flags, paper lanterns, and pots of tulips trucked in from the southern valley. Ravenhill hadn't hosted a large celebration since the floods. But this year, the town declared, "If we're still breathing, then we still have a reason to sing." And among all the signs of renewal, the one chosen to give the opening speech was none other than Bernice Alcott. The microphone wavered slightly as she took hold of it, her hand slender now, but still steady, still carrying the weight of decades as president of the Ravenhill Women's Council. She stood upon a plain wooden platform, no ornate backdrop behind her, only the sun, the wind, and hundreds of eyes watching, many of them belonging to people who had once heard her speak passionately about order, standards, and propriety. But this time, her voice sounded nothing like before. "I used to believe," she began, "that every creature ought to be raised into its proper role. I believed that a cat should sleep on a cushion, a dog should guard the door, and humans should know exactly where they belong in the order of things." She paused. A breeze passed through, brushing ribbons against the microphone like a whispered breath. "But then," she continued, her eyes falling on the front row, where Nova now sat in the lap of Emily, "I saw a cat who didn't choose the cushion. She chose to sit watch at the door of an old man living alone. I saw her swim through floodwater to save my granddaughter, and I saw that I had been wrong." This time no one laughed, no one whispered, only silence remained, but not the cold kind. It was a silence that listens, that waits for something real. Bernice drew in a long breath. "I want to offer an apology. First, to Mr. Walter Reed, who taught me a lesson in trust without ever needing to speak it. And then, to Nova." A single clap broke the stillness, then another, then 5, and suddenly the whole square erupted in applause, not because Bernice was well known, but because, in that moment, a monument had bowed, and in doing so had helped rebuild the trust Ravenhill thought it had lost. She leaned down, for the first time in years, and gently placed her hand atop Nova's head. The cat blinked. No hiss, no flinch. She only stretched her head forward, as if to say she had forgiven her long ago. And to many watching, it wasn't just a touch, it was a promise. Between two generations, between two once opposing beliefs, between two creatures, both once told they shouldn't belong together. Walter Reed had never been a writer. In 30 years as a firefighter, the only things he left behind were boot prints on burned soil, smoke stains on his sleeves, and the lingering scent of ash in his hair. But when the editor of the Ravenhill Observer invited him to contribute, he didn't say no. The letter had been brief. "We believe some stories shouldn't be told by someone else, and if anyone should write about Nova, it's you." Walter sat at his wooden desk, by a window still marked with smoke from the last fire. He used Eleanor's old fountain pen. The ink bled slightly, drying quickly in the sunlight. His first line wasn't an introduction, it was a question. "Have you ever witnessed something too strange to believe, but too true to deny?" He filled page after page, wrote of Nova, of Rex, of Toby, of Gia, of Eleanor, of the kind of cold that didn't come from weather, but from absence, and then of the day Nova appeared, not as a miracle but as a reply. Meanwhile, across town, in a room strewn with markers, glue sticks, and scraps of paper, 10-year-old Emily, the girl whose wide eyes once followed Nova everywhere, was starting her own project called Cross-Species Sociology. The name sounded grand, but it was mostly cardboard sheets, photographs, handwritten captions, and colorful arrows mapping behaviors Nova exhibited. That resembled a dog's. Examples: wakes up to fire sirens, sleeps by the door, swam in floodwater, barks. She pasted a photo of Rex curled beside Nova, adding a question below in red marker. What makes a cat do this? Love, imitation, or a new instinct, born from the heart? Emily didn't know where this project would go, but to her, Nova was the perfect subject. A creature that slipped through definitions, crossed categories, and in doing so, made boundaries feel a little less important. When Emily presented her project at school, the biology teacher, the same one who once lectured about conditioned reflexes, stood in silence for a long while. Then he said just one thing. "Sometimes science must bow before what it has no name for yet." And in a town that had once feared what was different, people began asking a different kind of question. Do we really need to know what Nova is? Or is it enough to know that she did something good? Nova had no fixed schedule, no colorful collar, no introductions when she arrived. And yet, somehow, her name began to slip into everyday conversations. Not loudly, not ceremoniously, but like a gentle whisper threading its way through the noise of daily life. At Ravenhill Elementary, Miss Monroe, who struggled with panic when speaking before large classes, shared a story. During a special lesson on diversity in nature, Nova had sat quietly in the corner of the classroom. Not a single student misbehaved. They simply watched. Watched the cat with her head tilted to one side, tail curled around her paws, eyes following each reader as if she understood something beyond language. "Do you see?" Miss Monroe said softly, hand resting on Nova's head. "Sometimes it's not us who teach animals how to live. Sometimes they teach us how to listen." At the Central Clinic, where veterans came to cope with post-traumatic stress, Nova was invited to take part in the non-verbal therapy program. No one asked her to do anything, no commands, no calls, but every time she would walk up to the person sitting furthest away, usually the quietest in the room, and sit down beside them. No pawing, no nudging, just presence. As if she knew what emptiness required. A veteran named Harold, who had lived withdrawn for 20 years, never allowing anyone to touch him, finally placed a hand on another living being. It happened after Nova sat by his side for 3 days in a row, never leaving. "She didn't need me to talk," he said, voice gravelly. "She just sat there, like she was telling me I didn't have to be okay right away." At the West Side nursing home, Nova became an unexpected companion during silent afternoons. The elderly began calling her the cat who knows when to keep quiet. Some knitted her tiny hats. Others left a special cloth on the stone bench, the one they used to sit on with someone they once loved, now gone. One photo made its way around more than any other. Nova, nestled between two old men, all three with their eyes closed, golden sunlight draped over their backs like a soft blanket. The caption read simply, "Together." No reason needed. And so, from a cat once dismissed as living against her instincts, Nova became what Ravenhill never knew it had so desperately needed. Not a mascot, not a brand, but a presence. A reminder that difference isn't something to be corrected, but something to be cherished. That same evening, as the sun turned the town's maple trees to liquid gold, Walter was invited to speak at a small community gathering where Ravenhill locals shared stories of positive change in the place they called home. Walter was never meant for the stage. He had never imagined himself with a microphone. But because of Nova, because of all that had happened, he stood up, wearing an old shirt and eyes no longer hiding what they felt. Behind him, Nova lay curled next to a boy with hyperactivity disorder. Strangely, since Nova arrived, the boy hadn't moved, hadn't shouted, just quietly sketched shapes in his notebook. It looked like a cat, surrounded by 3 dogs. Walter glanced around, then smiled gently. He didn't read from the notes he'd prepared. He simply spoke, in that slow, grounded cadence that matched the rhythm of his life. When my wife was alive, she once told me she wanted a cat, said our house needed a little softness. I didn't understand, and I lost her before I could. He paused, swallowing quietly. Then Nova came. A cat who didn't act like a cat. No one trained her to bark, to guard, to chase the siren. She just watched 3 dogs and chose to become part of them. Not because she forgot she was a cat, but because she knew being together doesn't always require the right identity. Sometimes it just needs the right feeling. The room stilled. The air itself seemed to lean in. Someone asked me, Walter continued, why I let a cat live like a dog. I don't have the perfect answer, but there's one thing I know for certain. He looked at Nova, his eyes glistening but calm. She's just trying to become the best thing she can be. Silence. Then a wave of applause. Not for the speech, but for what they finally understood. That not everything needs to fit a mold to be wonderful. That a single creature, a fallen star in the middle of a snowy season, could thaw an entire town. Not every story echoes the moment it's told, but sometimes a small article or a single quiet sentence can plant the seed of change in hearts that once fell silent. After Walter's article was published in the Mountain Portraits column of the Ravenhill Post, a handwritten letter arrived at the town's medical center, where Nova had recently been invited to visit. The envelope was old, the paper yellowed, the handwriting slightly unsteady. It came from Riverville, a small valley town just a few hours south of Ravenhill. Inside were a few carefully written lines. No embellishment, just truth. We've spent our lives in a place once known as the last stop for those no one wanted. But time passed. The children moved to the city. The farm is now only memory. After reading about you, and about Nova, we thought, perhaps, this place deserves to live again. Not with crops, but with heart. Signed, Mr. and Mrs. Howard, both over 80, once breeders of therapy dogs for people with disabilities, now preparing to move to the city for their final years. They had arranged to donate their home and land to Walter Reed, with only one condition. Let this place remain one where beings who aren't understood can still find home. Walter held the letter for a long time. He didn't cry, but Nova leapt into his lap, brushing against his elbow, as if she, too, understood. 2 weeks later, Walter's old pickup rolled down the road. In the back, Gia lay curled beside a canvas sack. Toby sat tall, eyes alert. Rex slept soundly, one leg folded beneath him, and Nova, as always, wasn't in a crate. She rode on Walter's shoulder, ears flicking toward every bird song that crossed their path. The Riverville farm lay nestled between two soft ridges, with a brown-tiled roof and a moss-covered porch. Weeds had grown wild. The windows were dusted over. But the place didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused. As if the house had merely been sleeping a very long time and now was waking for the right person. Walter stepped down from the truck, hands trembling with age. When he opened the wooden door, the late afternoon sun spilled in, landing on a wooden wall where an old leash hook still hung. Above it, a faded line of paint read, "Here, no one has to be like anyone else." He looked at Nova, then at the three dogs, and smiled. "We're home now." On their first day at the farm, the sky was clear, not the blinding clarity of summer, but the soft light of spring in the mountains, the kind that says this is a beginning, not with fanfare, but with certainty. Walter placed Eleanor's old wooden chair beneath the porch eaves, in the exact spot she once sat reading her books. He lowered himself into the seat, and Nova curled onto his lap. She didn't leap off like most cats. She simply folded her paws, rested her chin on his hand, like a little dog standing afternoon watch. In the yard, Rex lay under the shade of a pine, eyes half closed, sensing the rhythm of the ground beneath him. Gia ran along the fence line, claiming her new territory. Toby, as always, had already claimed the upper balcony as his lookout post. Nova remained among them. She didn't need to be introduced again. No need to redraw lines or reassert ranks. She just followed. She shadowed Toby's steps, ducked when Gia passed by, sat beside Rex when the old Malinois sighed after another lap around the yard. Walter watched it all unfold and murmured, "A place where nothing needs explaining." In the early days, Walter began transforming the old Howard kennels into a small supply shelter and emergency care bay. One room was designated to treat injured wildlife brought in from the nearby woods. The kitchen was cleaned, the old wooden shelves polished, and above the fireplace, he rehung Eleanor's photograph, this time with a new frame beside it. Nova, nestled peacefully between the three dogs, eyes closed, ears alert. And little by little, people from all over the valley began to stop by. Someone brought in a stray cat with a broken leg. Another asked for help with a nursing dog who had stopped eating. Children from the Riverville school came by, eager to play with the cat that knows how to bark. Elderly neighbors came seeking quiet, or simply to sit and watch Nova and the three Malinois share the afternoon sun on the porch. The old farm, once steeped in silence, had become something strange and beautiful. Not quite a rescue center, not a breeding kennel, not a retirement home. Just a space between worlds, between species, between people and animals, between the past and something quietly healing. One afternoon, a man with a camera came to visit, hoping to film a short video. He asked Walter, "What would you call this place?" Walter looked toward Nova, who at that moment was standing watch by the gate like a proper guard dog, then turned back and answered, "A place where no one has to change in order to stay. A place where you can be exactly who you are and still be loved." No one told Walter what to build. There were no blueprints, no taped-up charts on the walls. But from the very first morning at the farm, when Nova tapped lightly on the kitchen window with her paw, instead of walking around to the main entrance like the three dogs, he knew what he needed to do. He pulled out an old wooden ladder from the shed and propped it against the side of the old horse stable. There, he started installing narrow slats, just wide enough for a cat to climb, but sturdy enough that Toby once tried it to test its strength. On the roof eave, he cut a small square, fitted it with an old glass hatch, perfectly sized so Nova could come and go without waiting for anyone to open the door. On the living room windowsill, He placed a round, hand-knit cushion, the kind Eleanor used to love. And the moment Nova curled up there, her eyes half closed in the morning light, Walter understood. That space had become her private watchtower. Day by day, small details were added. A rope ladder hung down from the oak tree out back, a wooden bridge from the second-floor balcony to the top of the chicken coop. Tiny steps spiraling around a porch column, where Nova could perch and observe the dogs during whistle training drills. No one called it training. It wasn't a game either. It was a way for Nova to be a cat, with all her grace, independence, and silence, and still be a dog, with loyalty, instinct, and the longing to belong. Walter didn't say much, but whenever someone visited, he'd guide them around, pointing out little corners he had modified. "She likes to watch from up there," he'd say, or, "That's where the sunlight hits just right when she naps." One afternoon, Emily stopped by and pointed to the small wooden plaque he had fastened above the crawl-through window, where Nova often paused and looked back, as if waiting for a companion. The plaque read, carved by hand, "For the creature that walks between shadows and firelight." She turned to him and asked, "Uncle Walter, why do you do all this?" Nova never asked for any of it. Walter smiled and patted her head. "Because some creatures never ask for anything, yet they give us more than we ever knew we needed." Since then, folks around the valley began referring to the place by an unofficial name, the Farm Between Species. And Nova, as if she understood it all, continued climbing to the highest perch each evening, lying still as the sun poured through the open window. No fences, no commands, just the hope that someone would choose to listen, with their heart. That summer, the fields around the farm began turning golden. Sunlight stretched across the yard, across the shingles, across the soft fur of Nova as she dozed on the warm porch steps, and across the sparkling brown eyes of Emily as she opened the letter in her hands. The header read in bold, "Accepted into the Animal Social Behavior Research Program, Montana State University." The letter trembled slightly in her fingers. Not because of the wind. Grandma Bernice held her shoulder tight as they reread the second line. Project: The behavioral impact of interspecies family structures, recognized as one of the top 3 innovative research proposals of the year. From across the yard, Walter leaned on his shovel handle, chin resting on his palm. He didn't say anything, just nodded as if it had all been waiting to happen. Rex, Toby, and Gia lay beneath the trees. Nova stretched and stepped forward, lifting her head to meet Emily's eyes, as if waiting to hear the good news. "I told them everything," Emily whispered, running her fingers gently down Nova's back. "About how you listen with your heart, how you never tried to be like anyone else. You were just you." Then she looked up at Walter and beamed. "I'm going to name the project the Nova Effect." Walter laughed, a rare, open laugh no one had heard in a long time. "Sounds like a kind of supernova." Emily nodded. "Because it's the kind of light that bursts forth when a star everyone thought had died decides to burn bright one more time." Bernice turned away, eyes glistening, perhaps because of the wind. Or perhaps not. That evening, all of Ravenhill heard the news. No one seemed surprised. A girl once deemed too dreamy, a cat once called the wrong kind, an old man marked by invisible wounds, and 3 dogs who were once just tools. Now, they were the center of a new chapter, not only in research papers, but in the hearts of those who had once believed that right and wrong were the only 2 ends of the line. As the morning light filtered through the trees behind the newly built community rescue station, the eastern field stirred with sounds unlike alarms or shouted commands. Instead, there was only soft breathing and the gentle rhythm of wagging tails. Nova stepped out first. She wore no leash, no collar. Her silver-gray fur shimmered faintly under the sun. Ears perked, posture calm, like an old teacher returning to the classroom. Behind her came the three Malinois, Rex, Toby, and Gia, emerging one by one. And following them, a mixed band of dogs of every shape, age, and origin. Yet all had one thing in common. They had been abandoned. Each had once been labeled difficult to adapt. At the edge of the yard, a beagle who had been bullied in a training camp trembled, too afraid to move forward. A husky once left behind in the woods leaned forward, unsure what to do with the tether still loosely wrapped around his leg. A chubby pug, confined for too long in a glass crate, peeked out nervously from behind a tree. Nova gave no orders. She walked past each dog without touching, yet looked them each in the eye. She stopped before the beagle. No bark, no push, just lowered herself to the grass, leaving a distance that felt safe and natural. Then she slowly turned her head, gazing towards the open space, as if extending an invitation. Rex, steady in his age, sat calmly across the way. Gia waited near the path, eyes alert but patient. Toby, always the encourager, stood in the center of the yard, looking back at each dog, tail wagging as if to say, "We're here, take your time." 1 minute, then 5. And then the beagle stepped forward, trembling, sniffing the patch of grass Nova had just warmed. Nova didn't move, just breathed, just closed her eyes. That was enough. The husky moved a little closer. The pug rolled halfway out of the grass, huffing softly, then suddenly lunged forward with awkward courage. Watching from the operations room window, Walter saw something no training manual could describe. Nova wasn't leading like a dog. She was present, like a soul that knows how to listen. And for those who have been hurt, sometimes, that matters more than praise. At the crossroads of 2 old Riverville roads stood the new rescue station. It had no grand gate, no polished sign, just a wooden board with hand-painted white letters. A place for what was once left behind. Walter didn't build it alone. He was helped by those once thought unlikely to return to crowds. A war veteran who had lost his voice on his final mission now worked as a carpenter, building kennels from sketches of Nova curled in sleep. A young woman with a social communication disorder now prepared every animal meal, always leaving crayon notes on the trays that read, "Enjoy your meal, gentle friend." There was a row of pale yellow benches in the yard, where autistic children sat playing with wooden puzzle pieces beside Toby, or quietly stroked Gia's fur, or leaned their heads on Rex's side like seeking a heartbeat that didn't need words, and Nova, always in the center, but never loud. Strangely, the rhythm of the yard seemed to follow her. A silent step toward the old brick wall, and all the children's eyes would turn to look. One glance skyward at noon, and a little girl would giggle, "The kitty's watching clouds." One day, a mother arrived with her 7-year-old son, his eyes avoiding contact, his hands clenched. He stood outside the fence for nearly 10 minutes, not stepping in, not saying a word. Walter was about to gently approach, but Nova moved first, walking slowly toward the boy, not making eye contact, just sitting beside him like a friend waiting for the bus. Then something quiet but unforgettable happened. The boy sat down, placed his hand on Nova's back, and said nothing. But his mother cried. On another day, an old soldier placed a box at the station's front door. Inside was a blind dog named Rufus. "I don't know who else would think he deserves to live," the man whispered, then turned away. He returned the next morning and saw Rufus being guided by a deaf girl, with Nova walking behind them both like a watchful chaperone on their first adventure. The rescue station did not save the world, but it saved the little things the world often overlooked. And when night fell from the back observation room, Walter would see what Eleanor had once written in her old notebook. Not everyone needs a new house. Sometimes they just need a place that doesn't ask, "Why are you like this?" Now they had that place. As the final harvest festival of the year approached, all of Riverville gathered around the yard of the rescue station. Not for a show, not for selfies with the famous cat. They came to sit quietly beneath warm yellow lights, listening to the peaceful breaths of beings once cast aside, now simply present. People who had once felt different were seen through eyes that did not judge, and in that shared presence, no one felt out of place anymore. Nova lay in the middle of the lawn, her back resting gently against Rex, one paw draped over Toby's leg, and her head nestled atop Gia's belly. A young girl approached quietly and placed a delicate paper flower crown around Nova's neck. Nova didn't flinch. She simply blinked, as if she understood. Walter watched from a distance. He didn't step forward, didn't interrupt the moment. He stood among the quiet crowd, clutching Eleanor's old notebook, its spine worn, the first page stained by time and smudged ink. Under the amber light of sunset, he whispered, "Nova isn't just a cat who behaves like a dog. She is the light for souls that were never given a name. And she has found what we're all searching for, a place where loyalty rises above species." And as Nova lifted her head to meet his gaze, in a moment that stretched like an entire journey, no one saw her as cat or dog or anything else. She was just Nova, a fallen star that landed in the hands of someone who once believed he had lost everything. A soul who chose how to love, and in doing so, helped others choose to live again. Some stories don't need miracles. They only need a heart willing to listen, and a gaze that doesn't rush to judge. The story of Nova, a cat raised and protected by 3 Malinois, is no longer just a strange tale whispered around Ravenhill. It is a reminder that loyalty, love, and healing have never been bound by species or by the boxes we once believed defined what's normal. The German shepherds, Rex, Toby, and Gia, whose history is etched with missions and rescues, opened their hearts to something utterly unlike themselves. And Nova, though born without a bark, learned how to love in the language of silent companionship. In a world quick to label right and wrong, function and instinct, the presence of a cat who lived like a dog opened a different door, one where kindness is offered before explanation, where anyone, regardless of shape or voice, can become the best version of themselves. Because love doesn't ask for sameness, it only asks for a place to belong, and someone who won't walk away when the storm rolls in.